The street was quiet that evening, the kind of eerie stillness that makes even the softest footsteps echo against the cracked sidewalks. Miss Evelyn, a 79-year-old woman who had lived in this neighborhood longer than most of its residents had been alive, walked with a careful but steady pace. She clutched her small purse close to her side, her worn but dignified coat wrapped tight around her frail frame. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, shifting shadows against the brick walls of the buildings lining the road. She wasn't afraid. Not really. She had seen too much in her lifetime to let a few darkened corners shake her. But there was something in the air tonight, something that made her grip her keys a little tighter and glance over her shoulder more often than usual. Then the voices came. Low at first, a murmur drifting on the cold night air. Then laughter, sharp, taunting. Miss Evelyn stopped in her tracks, her heart tapping against her ribs like a steady drum. She turned her head slowly, just enough to see them. A group of young men, their figures shifting in and out of the shadows as they moved toward her. Their steps were lazy, unhurried, like they had all the time in the world. "Where you headed so late, Granny?" one of them called out, his voice laced with amusement. Another one laughed. "Ain't safe out here for old folks like you." Miss Evelyn didn't respond. She wasn't one to engage in foolishness. She just kept walking, hoping they'd lose interest. But the footsteps behind her quickened, closing the distance. She wasn't fast enough to outrun them, and she knew it. A hand grabbed at her coat. Not rough, yet. Just testing, like a predator sizing up its prey. She pulled away, her breath hitching, but she kept moving. Then a shove. Not enough to send her to the ground, but enough to jolt her, to remind her that she was outnumbered, outmatched. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had faced storms before. She had endured hardships that would break most people. But this was different. And then she remembered. With trembling fingers, she reached into her coat pocket, her pulse hammering as she felt for it, the small, folded piece of paper she had kept for years. A note written in hurried but careful handwriting, given to her by someone she had almost forgotten. Someone who had once made a choice that changed everything. Miss Evelyn took a deep breath. And then, with the last bit of strength she had, she pulled out her phone. She dialed the number she never thought she'd have to use. The gang loomed closer, their laughter now a low hum, waiting for her next move. She pressed the phone to her ear. And when the voice on the other end picked up, she whispered just 2 words. "It's time." The voice on the other end was silent for a moment, like the person was processing what they just heard. Then a breath. A deep inhale, slow and measured, followed by the quietest exhale. Miss Evelyn gripped the phone tighter, her fingers shaking. The boys around her were watching, waiting. One of them, taller than the rest, with a hoodie pulled low over his eyes, stepped closer. He tilted his head, his lips curling in a smirk. "Who you calling, huh? Cops ain't gonna get here fast enough." Miss Evelyn didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the ground, her knuckles whitening as she held the phone. The voice on the other end finally spoke. "I'm on my way." That was all. 3 words. No questions, no hesitation. Just a promise. The call ended, but Miss Evelyn kept the phone pressed to her ear for a few more seconds, steadying herself. She could still feel the warmth of that note in her pocket, the edges of it softened from being unfolded and refolded too many times. She had never expected to use it. Not like this. One of the boys scoffed. "Man, she ain't got nobody coming for her." He nudged his friend, chuckling under his breath. "Old lady's just wasting her minutes." Miss Evelyn finally looked up, her dark brown eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them now, just something else. Something heavier. The boy faltered for half a second before shaking his head, brushing off whatever strange feeling had passed between them. The streetlight above them flickered, casting brief moments of darkness between pools of dim yellow light. A car passed at the far end of the block, its tires humming against the pavement before disappearing into the night. Miss Evelyn knew she had to stall. She had to keep them there just a little longer. Her voice was calm when she spoke, steady in a way that made the boys shift slightly on their feet. "You ever hear the story about the boy on the bus?" One of them laughed. "Lady, what are you talking about?" She ignored him. Her eyes flickered to the tallest boy, the one who had first spoken. There was something about him. Something familiar, though she couldn't quite place it yet. Years ago, she said, her voice carrying just enough to hold their attention. A young man, about your age, maybe younger, was sitting on a crowded bus. It was winter. Cold outside, colder inside. The kind of cold that gets in your bones. One of the boys shifted. Another rolled his eyes. But none of them walked away. Miss Evelyn continued. A woman got on. She was pregnant. Her coat was too thin for the weather, and she looked tired, real tired. Like life had already taken more from her than she could afford to lose. The tall one scoffed, crossing his arms. And Miss Evelyn tilted her head slightly. And there weren't no seats left. Silence. She let it stretch between them, letting the weight of it settle before she spoke again. That boy, he had a choice. He could pretend not to see her like everybody else did. Or he could do something. One of the younger boys snorted. Man, what's this got to do with us? Miss Evelyn just looked at him. Everything. The tallest one was watching her now, his smirk gone. There was something in his eyes, something behind them. He wouldn't admit it, maybe not even to himself, but he was listening. Really listening. Miss Evelyn took a step forward. That boy stood up. Gave her his seat. Didn't think twice about it. Didn't do it for attention. Didn't do it for a thank you. He just did it because it was the right thing to do. One of the boys let out a short laugh, but there was no real humor in it. So what? He got a gold star or something? Miss Evelyn shook her head. No. But she gave him something. The tallest one frowned slightly. His arms had dropped from his chest, hanging loosely at his sides. Miss Evelyn reached into her coat pocket, pulling out the small, folded piece of paper. A note. She held it up between her fingers. A simple note. But it changed everything. The wind picked up slightly, sending a dry leaf skittering across the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed faintly before fading away. Miss Evelyn watched the boys carefully, her fingers tightening around the note. You see, sometimes kindness comes back to you when you least expect it. Sometimes, the smallest act can set something in motion that you don't even understand until years later. The boys were quiet now. The playful taunts had faded, the smirks replaced with something else. A discomfort, maybe. Or curiosity. Miss Evelyn didn't know how much longer she had to stall. But she could feel it. Change was in the air. She just had to hold on a little longer. The tallest boy finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. So, what was in the note? Miss Evelyn let out a slow breath, her fingers brushing over the old creases. A promise. Footsteps sounded in the distance. Slow, steady, purposeful. And for the first time that night, the boys turned their heads, glancing over their shoulders. Miss Evelyn's grip on the note tightened. She had made the call. And now, someone had answered. The footsteps were slow but deliberate, each one measured, cutting through the uneasy silence, like a clock ticking down. The boys stiffened, their bravado fading as they glanced toward the end of the street. The tallest one clenched his jaw, shifting his weight like he was deciding whether to stand his ground or disappear into the shadows. Miss Evelyn didn't move. She just watched, her fingers pressing against the worn note in her hand, her pulse steady despite the tension thickening around her. The sound grew closer. A figure stepped into the dim light of the flickering street lamp, their face still hidden in the shadows. The boys exchanged looks, their once playful arrogance replaced with something much closer to caution. Miss Evelyn finally spoke, her voice low but firm. I told you. Kindness comes back when you least expect it. The figure stepped forward. The glow of the street lamp finally revealed his face. He wasn't a police officer. Not some random stranger passing by. He was younger than Miss Evelyn but older than the boys, maybe in his late 20s, early 30s. His frame was solid, his posture relaxed but intentional, like someone who knew exactly how to carry himself. His eyes flickered across the group, sharp and observant, taking in every detail before settling on Miss Evelyn. The tallest boy tensed. Who's this? His voice had lost some of its edge, but he was still holding on to whatever control he thought he had left. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Miss Evelyn. There was something unspoken between them, a quiet understanding that didn't need words. Then his gaze shifted to the tallest boy. You don't remember me, do you? The boy frowned, his brow knitting together in frustration. Man, I don't know you. The man nodded slowly, like he expected that answer. Then, he turned to Miss Evelyn. "May I?" She hesitated only a moment before extending the note to him. He took it carefully, unfolding it with the same reverence one might use with an old photograph. His eyes scanned the familiar handwriting, and a small, almost wistful smile touched his lips before it vanished. "I was about your age when I met her," the man said, nodding toward Miss Evelyn. Didn't know how much one moment could change everything. He held up the note. "Didn't know a few words on a piece of paper could mean more than money, more than anything else I thought mattered at the time." The tallest boy crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man studied him, really looking at him now. "You ever wonder how you got here?" His voice was calm, but there was something underneath, something steady, something unshakable. "The choices you made, the people you ran with, the things you let happen, ever think about where it's leading?" The boy's mouth twitched, like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the right words. His friends shifted beside him, their unease growing. Miss Evelyn finally spoke, her voice softer now. "That boy on the bus, the one who gave up his seat, he didn't know what his kindness would come back as. He just knew he had a choice." She looked at the tallest boy, her gaze unwavering. "And so do you." The boy swallowed hard. For the first time, he looked less like someone trying to prove something and more like someone who wasn't sure what came next. The man folded the note carefully, slipping it into his pocket before taking a step closer. He wasn't threatening, but there was a presence about him, something that demanded attention. "You think you know everything, but you don't. And that's okay. I didn't either." His voice lowered just enough that they had to really listen. "But you're at a crossroads right now. You might not see it, but you are." The boys stayed silent, their confidence unraveling thread by thread. Then, the sound of a car rolling slowly down the street broke the moment. Headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across them. The man glanced at Miss Evelyn again. "Go inside now." She hesitated only for a moment, her eyes lingering on the tallest boy. There was something behind his tough exterior, something she recognized. She had seen it before. Pain. Not the kind that comes from a single bad decision, but the kind that builds over time. The kind that makes a person think they don't have any other options. Miss Evelyn gave him one last look before turning and walking toward her building. The man didn't move, didn't look away as the boys stood frozen in place, like they were waiting for something to happen. The car rolled past, the driver slowing just enough to take in the scene before disappearing down the road. The tallest boy exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Man, whatever." His voice wasn't as steady as it had been before. "We out." The others hesitated but eventually turned to leave with him. But just as the tallest boy took his first step away, the man called out, "You'll see it one day." His voice was steady, certain. "You'll look back and know exactly what this night was." The boy didn't respond. He just kept walking, his pace quicker than before. Miss Evelyn watched from her window as they disappeared down the block. She let out a slow breath, pressing a hand over her heart. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew the seed had been planted. Miss Evelyn sat by her window long after the boys had disappeared into the night. The air outside was still, but something in her bones told her this wasn't over. She had lived long enough to know that moments like this don't just fade, they ripple. The choices made tonight would carry forward, for better or worse. She reached into her pocket, fingers brushing over the folded note once more. It was strange how a small act of kindness, given so long ago, still held weight. She thought of the man who had come when she called, the one who had once been a boy on a bus, cold but willing to stand for someone else. Now here he was again, standing in a different way, protecting, guiding. Outside, the street remained quiet, but not empty. The man still stood near the curb, his hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the darkness like he was waiting for something. Or maybe he just wasn't ready to leave yet. Miss Evelyn sighed, rising from her chair with slow, careful movements. She made her way to her small kitchen, filling an old kettle with water and setting it on the stove. The click of the burner igniting was the only sound in the apartment. As she waited for the water to boil, her mind drifted back to the tallest boy, the one with the sharp edges and restless energy. She had seen something flicker in his eyes, just for a second. Doubt. Hesitation. A crack in the wall he had built around himself. and cracks, no matter how small, meant something could still break through. Outside, the man finally moved, glancing once more toward Miss Evelyn's window before turning away. His footsteps were steady as he disappeared down the sidewalk. But even as he left, the feeling in the air remained, something unfinished, something waiting. And he wasn't wrong to feel that way. Because just a few blocks away, under the orange glow of another streetlight, the tallest boy stood with his hands clenched into fists. His friends had left, laughing and joking as if the night had been nothing more than a passing moment. But he hadn't followed them. Instead, he stood there, jaw tight, thoughts racing. The man's words stuck in his head, unwelcome but refusing to leave. You'll see it one day. You'll look back and know exactly what this night was.
What did he mean by that?
What was there to see? He shook his head, frustrated. He had spent years surviving, learning the rules of the street, knowing when to push and when to walk away. But this felt different. His fingers twitched as he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. His thumb hovered over a contact before he stopped himself.
No.
He couldn't go back now. He had already made his choices. But still, something gnawed at him, deep in his chest, like a warning he didn't fully understand yet. Before he could decide what to do, the distant hum of an engine made him turn. A black car rolled up to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. It slowed but didn't stop. Just enough to make its presence known. The boy stiffened. He knew this car. And he knew what it meant when it showed up like this, silent, deliberate, watching. A window rolled down just an inch, enough for a voice to slip through. You still in, or are you wasting our time? His pulse pounded. The moment stretched long and thin, pulling tight like a thread about to snap. This was the choice. The real one. Not some old lady story. Not some man's warning. This. Right here. He exhaled slowly, hands tightening at his sides. The weight of the night, the words spoken, the unspoken ones lingering in his mind. It all came down to this 1 second.
He could step forward. Get in.
Keep going down the path he knew too well. Or he could turn around. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, heart slamming against his ribs. The car idled, waiting. Miss Evelyn's words echoed faintly in his head. That boy had a choice. The air felt heavy. The street seemed too quiet. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what to do. The boy's breath was slow and measured, but his mind was racing. The car's engine rumbled low, steady, like it had all the time in the world. The voice from inside had gone quiet, but the message was clear. He was being watched. The street around him felt too still, too expectant, like even the night was waiting for him to move. His fingers twitched at his sides. He had stood in moments like this before, where hesitation could cost everything. The rules were simple. Step up, don't back down, don't overthink. But for the first time, those rules felt heavy, like chains instead of guidance. Something shifted inside the car. A small movement, barely noticeable. But he caught it. A warning. His stomach tightened. They were testing him. They wanted to see where he stood, if he was hesitating, if he was still solid. And the problem was, he didn't know anymore. He thought of Miss Evelyn's eyes, steady and knowing. He thought of the man's words, the way he had stood there like he had already seen the future and knew how this would end. He thought of the cold night on the bus, the moment that had led to all of this, and the simple choice that had changed everything. Then his fingers moved, barely, just a twitch. But it was enough. The car door clicked.
Not open, not yet.
Just unlocked. An invitation. His breath caught. This was it. If he stepped forward, there was no turning back. No second chances. And then, just when he thought the night couldn't get heavier, his phone vibrated. A single buzz in his pocket.
Soft. Quick.
Almost unnoticeable. But he noticed. His heartbeat kicked harder. His hands curled into fists. No one ever called him at this time of night. The people he ran with didn't do check-ins, didn't send messages just to talk. If his phone was ringing now, it was either bad news or something worse. The car stayed still. The voice inside didn't push him. They wanted him to make this choice on his own. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the smooth glass of his phone. He pulled it out. One new message. No name. Just a number. 3 words. Don't get in. His breath caught in his throat. His fingers clenched around the phone. His eyes flickered back to the car, but his body stayed frozen. The voice inside spoke again, this time lower, firmer. "You good?" He didn't answer. The message sat heavy on the screen. It didn't make sense.
Who sent it?
How did they know? His mind raced through possibilities, but none of them felt right. Then, another vibration. "Walk away."
Now.
His pulse slammed in his ears. This wasn't random. Someone was watching. Someone who knew what was happening in real time. His grip tightened around the phone. He couldn't see anyone. The street looked empty, the buildings quiet, but he knew better. There were eyes in the dark. And suddenly he knew this wasn't just about him anymore. The car door cracked open an inch. A boot touched the pavement. The air shifted. He had seconds to decide. The message on the screen burned into his vision. His muscles locked. His heartbeat roared in his ears. And then, a single movement in the distance. Just a shadow, barely there. But he saw it. Someone was out there, in the dark, waiting for what happened next. And for the first time, he realized, maybe this night wasn't just about his choice. Maybe he wasn't the only one in danger. The boy's breath was shallow, his grip on the phone tightening as he stared at the message. His instincts screamed at him to move, to do something, but he felt trapped between the weight of the moment and the unknown threat lurking just out of sight. The car door remained cracked open, the boot resting on the pavement like a silent demand. The voice inside hadn't spoken again, but the expectation hung heavy in the air. He forced himself to look up, scanning the street. There was no one, at least no one visible. But he knew better. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. The messages weren't a coincidence. They were a warning. His fingers hovered over the phone screen, debating whether to respond, but before he could make a decision, another buzz shook the device in his palm. Go to her. Her. His chest tightened. Miss Evelyn. The pieces clicked together too fast. The way the man had shown up earlier, knowing exactly when to intervene. The way Miss Evelyn had looked at him, like she saw something beneath the surface. The way she had spoken about choices, about kindness, about things coming back when you least expected them. And now this message. He took a slow step back, away from the car. He could feel the shift immediately. The person inside stiffened, sensing hesitation. The boot on the pavement adjusted slightly, ready to push up or step forward. The boy swallowed hard. His voice felt stuck in his throat, but he forced the words out anyway.
Nah.
Not tonight. Silence. The boot didn't move. The door stayed ajar. The street remained still. Then, finally, the voice spoke. You sure about that? The words were smooth, careful, like they were offering a final chance to reconsider. But he had already made his choice.
Yeah.
Another pause. Then, without another word, the boot pulled back, the door shut, and the car engine rumbled softly. The boy stood frozen as the vehicle idled for a moment longer, as if weighing his decision. Then, just as quietly as it had arrived, it rolled forward, slow and deliberate, before disappearing around the corner. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His body was still tense, his fingers curled into fists, but the moment had passed. The danger wasn't gone, though. He looked down at his phone again. The message sat there like a command, impossible to ignore. Go to her. Without hesitating, he turned and started running. The streets blurred past him, his sneakers pounding against the pavement, heart racing faster than his legs could carry him. He didn't know what he was running toward, only that something told him he had to be there.
Now.
When he finally reached Miss Evelyn's building, something felt off. The lights in her window were still on, but the hallway leading up to her door was too quiet. His breathing was ragged as he climbed the steps, but the weight pressing against his chest had nothing to do with exhaustion. He hesitated at her door, his pulse hammering. Then he knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. A fresh wave of urgency shot through him. He pressed his ear against the wood, straining to hear any movement inside. Then just barely a muffled sound. His stomach dropped. He tried the doorknob.
Locked.
Without thinking, he stepped back and slammed his shoulder into the door. It didn't budge. He did it again, harder. The old wood groaned, the hinges rattling. Then, finally, it burst open. The scene inside made his breath catch. Miss Evelyn was on the floor, Her frail body slumped against the couch, one hand gripping her chest. She was conscious, her eyes flickering toward him as he stumbled inside. But she was struggling, her breath shallow, her skin pale. He rushed to her side, panic clawing at his throat. "Miss Evelyn, hey, I got you, okay? Just hold on." Her fingers weakly curled around his wrist. She was trying to say something, but the words wouldn't come. His hands shook as he grabbed his phone, his fingers fumbling to dial. He barely registered the operator's voice before he was shouting into the speaker, his heart slamming against his ribs. "I need an ambulance now." As he spoke, his gaze dropped to the floor beside her. And there, lying just out of reach of her fingertips, was the note. The same one she had held earlier. But now, something was different. There was fresh ink at the bottom, scrawled in shaky handwriting. A single name. His. His breath caught, a wave of emotion swelling in his chest. She had written his name. Even now, after everything, she still believed in him. The sound of sirens filled the night, growing closer with every second. He tightened his grip on her hand, holding on like it was the only thing keeping him steady. And maybe in that moment it was. The sirens grew louder, flashing red and blue lights spilling through the open doorway, casting flickering shadows across the room. The boy didn't move from Miss Evelyn's side, his hand still wrapped around hers, holding on as if letting go would make her slip away. Her breathing was slow but steady, her fingers weak against his, but she was still here. That was all that mattered. The paramedics rushed in, their voices calm but urgent as they assessed her condition. One of them knelt beside her, speaking softly, checking her pulse, shining a light in her eyes. The boy barely registered their words. His heart pounded as he watched them work, his body tense like he was bracing for something worse. "She's stable," one of the paramedics finally said. "But we need to get her to the hospital." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He didn't know what to do, what to say. He just knew he couldn't leave her. They lifted her onto the stretcher carefully, securing her before wheeling her toward the door. As they passed, her eyes fluttered open again, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something. But no words came, just a small squeeze of his hand before her fingers slipped away. And then, just like that, she was gone, whisked away into the night, swallowed by the flashing lights. The boy stood frozen in the quiet apartment, his chest tight. His gaze dropped to the floor, to the note still lying there. He bent down, picking it up with shaking hands. The paper was thin, worn at the edges, carrying years of meaning within its folds. He smoothed it open, his eyes scanning the familiar words, the same ones that had changed a man's life years ago. But now, at the bottom, in trembling handwriting, was his own name. It hit him all at once. The weight of everything. She had known. Somehow, in a way only she could, she had seen something in him, something buried beneath the layers of anger and fear. And even now, even in her weakest moment, she had wanted him to know he wasn't lost. He wasn't beyond saving. A shaky breath escaped him, his fingers curling around the note like it was the most important thing he had ever held. He wasn't sure how long he stood there before a familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You made the right choice." He turned sharply. The man from earlier stood just inside the doorway, his expression unreadable. The boy swallowed hard. "You knew this was going to happen, didn't you?" The man exhaled, stepping further into the dimly lit apartment. "Not exactly. But I knew tonight was important for both of us." The boy frowned.
Why?
The man's gaze softened. "Because someone once gave me a chance when I needed it most. And now I do the same when I see someone standing at that same crossroads." The boy looked down at the note again, his mind turning over everything that had led him here.
The bus. The gang. The choice.
The messages. The car. Miss Evelyn. None of it had been random. He let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders loosening just a little. "What happens now?" The man studied him for a moment before nodding toward the door. "That depends on you." The boy hesitated. He had spent so long believing there was only one road for him, that his choices had already been made, his future already set. But standing here now, with the note in his hand and the weight of the night pressing against his chest, he realized, maybe that wasn't true. Maybe he still had a choice. He glanced back at the apartment one last time, at the space Miss Evelyn had filled with warmth and wisdom. Then, he folded the note carefully, slipping it into his pocket. And without another word, he followed the man out into the night. The air was cool, the city still humming around them. But for the first time in a long time, the boy felt something new.
Hope.
And this time, he wasn't letting it go.